Hello, I'm Dr. Ron England, and this is a video on using JavaScript for validation and HTML5. And I'm going to take you through using a HTML page that I've created called HTML form, where I've created an HTML form that looks something like this form right here. And in this form, I have 6 fields for user input that I'm going to allow users to submit as a form with one submit button. I'm actually viewing this one right now inside of Google Chrome. So let's look a little bit about what I'm going to do here. Now in this form here, I've got what I did is I put in parentheses the different types of validation that I used for validating the individual fields. So the first field that I have here called enter name will be validated using JavaScript. The other fields I'm going to have validated using HTML5, and I'll show you how to do that. So going back over to my HTML page, I have it. It's a standard page with a head. I have a script because I do have a JavaScript that I'm going to explain here in a minute. But the tag that I have that's the important tag here is the form tag. Now, in this case, the form tag is given a name. So the form on the page has the name my form. It has an action. And in this case, the action is what the form does when you submit using the submit button. And it will actually post the results of this form back to htmlform.html, which is, by the way, the same file that you're in. So in other words, the form would have to be able to process itself. Now, in this case, I am not putting any processing code within the form. We're going to talk about that in a different lecture about how to process the results of a form. Let's start looking at the different input fields. And the first input field I'm going to look at here is this field where you enter the name. And in this case, I have an input, and the type of the input is type text. And it also has, this input has a name called name. And the only reason I call the name of this input name is because it's where you're going to enter a name. I could have called it something else, but in this case I do use name. Now, down here I've got an input of type submit with the value of submit, which is going to show a button called submit. And if I go back to the form, the onSubmit, which is an action, this action will return validate form, which in this case is a JavaScript. So let's go up and look at that JavaScript. This is a JavaScript function called validate form, and as I said, it's going to be called when the user hits the submit button within the form. In this JavaScript function, I define a variable called fname, and using the document object model, I take the document dot forms. Forms will return an array of forms, basically a collection of forms, and I can access the specific field by using the array elements my form and name as the first dimension and the second dimension of the forms collection. So my form here is my form, that's the form, and name is an element within the form, which is that input element. And then the dot value returns the value. So fname will return the value that the user inputs into that field. Then I call a second function called validate not blank, and I pass it two arguments, one being the name that the user entered and the other one being the text string name. Now I'm going to show you here why I do that. So if this is empty and I hit submit, it says please enter a value for name. Okay, so it's saying you need to go into this space here and enter a value. If I enter a value and hit submit, it actually submits that. So you can see it didn't give me, I hit the submit button and it didn't give me that little window there. What it did do is it went up here to the top and it took the results of what I put here and put it up there. Okay, so you can see that it actually submitted that information. Okay, bring this back over. So the return validate not blank is a function that I wrote specifically to check to see if the field is blank. And you pass it a string called value and you pass it a second string called label. And all I do is I check to see if that value is equal to null using the equals operator, equal operator, which is the two equals next to each other, and that's a comparison operator. And I check to see if it's null or it's blank, and if it's either one of those, I say please enter a value for the label. Remember, the label was being passed over here, so it says please enter a value for name, and then it returns false. If it doesn't find that this isn't entered, it returns a true, and it goes back to validate form, and this then returns the validate not blank, which also returns a true. Because this is an onSubmit, the function validate form will allow you to either submit or not submit. If it returns a false, the submission doesn't actually occur. If it returns a true, the submission does occur. So you can see that that simple piece of JavaScript has the ability to give user feedback and also prevent you from submitting bad information. And this is one method of actually doing this. We're going to look a little bit at the other elements on this page. So you've seen the text element here, but I've got some other elements that are on this page that we'll go back to Google Chrome and look at. I have a color picker. As you can see, it's got this ability to pick colors. So I can pick those. Okay, and if I put a name in here, okay, so it allows you to do submission of colors. It has a date picker, so you can see it, and this is a date picker. It has an email with validation, so if I try to input a bad email, it tells me to please enter an email address. It has a number selector. Only allows me to select numbers between 1 and 10. If I try to go past 10, it won't let me. If I try to go below 1, it won't let me. And it actually has a little range picker right here too. Now, these are all elements that are available within HTML5. And the way that you do that, and it's very simple to do in HTML5, is I have this input type, and the type can be color, date, email, number, range. Okay, in the case of like number or range, I have mins and maxes that I can set, and even a default value. And in Chrome, which is a HTML5 compliant browser, you're actually going to get some pretty nice tools that are automatically going to allow you the submission of these things. Now, if we looked at this in some of the other browsers, like in this case, I'm looking at a version of Firefox, which is not HTML5 compliant, you can see that you don't get the ability to bring up a color picker or a date picker. It does have some validation, like if I try to enter a bad email, it's going to go ahead and tell me to enter a good email address. Or for example, if I try to submit a blank name, it's going to still give me that JavaScript that says please enter a value for name, okay, that I had written into the JavaScript. So you can see the JavaScript always works. If I were to do the same thing in Internet Explorer, which I have right here, you can see that I still got that ability. It tells me that I have to enter a value for name. But it doesn't have all the nice tools that you see in the Google Chrome for these other types of ranges, types of input types. Now, this is true in older browsers, but as new versions of the browsers come forward, they actually have higher levels of compliance with HTML5. At the time I've shot this video, HTML5 is just reaching the recommendation stage, so it's not a final version that the browsers would necessarily be compliant with. But you can see how this whole thing works. So looking at this, you can see that I've created a form. I have input fields within the form. I have labels that specifically tell the user what I need to put into those input fields. I have a submit button that is also an input that gives me a button. I have the form, an onSubmit, basically capturing the action of that submit that returns validate form. And I have a function written in JavaScript called validate form that returns true or false of whether that form is actually valid. So it's very straightforward, very easy to do, and hopefully you'll be able to follow this and create some great types of forms for yourself when you need to. JavaScript and validation is one of the most common things that you do on websites when you have form input. Thank you very much, and good programming.